So I previously said that my favorite piece of a sales letter to write is the lead. And that is true 90 some percent of the time, but really, really, really close to the lead is the story. I love writing stories. I think most people do. And we're going to have a lot of fun in this section. Many great sales letters have two stories, the nightmare story and the discovery story. So in the nightmare story, you talk about how awful things were for you. Now this is nice to have. It's not absolutely 100% necessary, especially with warmer leads, but it's pretty damn important, especially if you got cold leads. So we're going to talk a lot about nightmare stories. And then discovery stories are how you turn things around. And I would say that this is absolutely required, even if you're a big company. Even if you're talking about the evolution of what you're doing, this gets people to buy into who you are, the discovery story. And you can think of these stories as the hero's journey. So if you've not done a whole lot of studying on the hero's journey, that's fine. But the hero's journey is a sort of narrative arc that underlies many of our generation's most popular movies, not just our generation's, the last few generations, popular movies, stories, even all the way back, I believe, to the Iliad and the Odyssey. They have elements of the hero's journey in them. So the hero's journey is essentially, you introduce this character, they live in, reality number one, and then something just dramatically changes. They're called on a mission. They're reluctant at first, but then they finally accept it. And then over the course of that mission, they are profoundly transformed. They take on new powers, abilities, and skills, and they, return to reality number one, or that first place, but now they're a completely changed person. And during the course of this transformation, they've probably fought some bad guys and, perhaps saved the world along the way. So if this sounds anything like Star Wars or The Hunger Games or any number of other big movies that you may have seen, that is not an accident. The hero's journey is just such a useful storytelling arc that Joseph Campbell, who sort of brought it to the surface as this as the notion of an independent thing, he would say that this is probably something that is endemic to the human experience, and that's one of the reasons why it resonates with us so much. So if you're interested in learning more about the hero's journey, and I hope you are, then I would suggest starting with The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and that is by Joseph Campbell. And I would also suggest The Writer's Journey, which is the hero's journey for writers. Both are exceptional pieces of literature, or not quite literature, I guess you would call them exceptional pieces of books. So that's as good as we're going to get today. Go read them, and let's jump into the nightmare story. So the nightmare story is meant to build a connection with the prospect about how bad things were. Now, if you are selling, let's say, a physical product, you're selling something on Kickstarter or just from your own website that is not an information product, then this may or may not be necessary. But if you are selling a non-information product, you can use elements of the nightmare story to compare to other things that exist, the current state of the art which you are replacing and improving. And we'll talk about how to do that in a minute. When I write the nightmare stories, my goals are the following. First, I want to take the prospect emotionally down. I want to make the prospect feel a little bad and highlight some of the things the prospect feels about their current situation. The reason for that is because if we feel pain, we're more likely to be motivated to action. And people do like emotional roller coasters. They like to go down and then they like to go up, and so I feel completely comfortable doing this and putting out sort of, I don't want to say negative vibes, but creating this story where the prospect feels like, oh my God, like, yeah, that I feel really awful when I think about my situation in relationship to this story that they're telling right now. We want to stir up the pot of the prospect's emotions so they feel a little bit of anger, a little bit of frustration, certainly some pain, so that when we start to introduce the discovery story and the product itself, the effect is that we've got their attention, we've got them hooked, and now their emotions are kind of coming along. When we tell the nightmare story, we want their emotions to go like this, hit the bottom, and then through the discovery story and the and the product introduction, we're bringing them right back up and just pumping them up full of hope and excitement and enthusiasm. So that is the first element of what a good nightmare story does. The second element is that it shows the prospect that he or she is not alone in their thoughts and actions. And to talk about this point in the next point, I'm going to contextualize it with my nightmare story from the girlfriend system, which has probably been the one that has connected the most with the most people. And a lot of people, by the way, when you see it, people ask, is it true? And yes, it is true. I had awful beliefs about women. I didn't understand them at all, and I made a lot of fucking stupid mistakes. So, what are my thoughts and actions in the nightmare story of the girlfriend sales letter? Well, some of my thoughts are that I thought women were attracted to good-looking guys with money and nice cars and abs. I thought that I had to spend a whole bunch of money impressing a woman in order for her to want to date me. I thought that the more gifts that I bought somebody, the more that they would like me. And essentially, the more of a good guy who I was, who just kind of, really went all out for a woman, the more that she would want to be my girlfriend. And so these are thoughts that many of our prospects have. They feel the sense of, if I do X, I deserve Y. And, it's interesting, since I put the sales letter out, so many women have, commented on, oh, this is just misogynistic crap, women, you don't deserve anything from a woman just because you spend money on her. And, I want to say, yeah, I fucking know, but, I can't, because I didn't write the sales letter for women. I wrote it for men who shared the same bad, negative beliefs that I used to. So that's a good sign that you are, that you have a good nightmare story, is that some people look at it and they say, I can't believe how awful you were, how dumb you are. Things don't work this way. But other people are like, oh my God, yeah, I do that exact thing. Again, it shows the prospects that are not alone in their thoughts or actions. So those are the thoughts, by the way, my thoughts and beliefs. And then also actions. I spent a whole bunch of money on dates. I showed up at her house unannounced. I did all these dumb things that, our prospects have done. And they write to me and they say, man, I've done that too. The other sort of flip side to that coin is that it shows the prospect that others, or in this case the narrator, has had it bad or worse than the prospect. So in my story, I show up at her door with a whole bunch of flowers and gifts and whatnot, and I'm greeted by the sight of this guy coming to the door who is wearing a towel and nothing more. And then my love interest shows up moments later, and she's wearing a sheet. And I don't say it in the sales letter, but anybody can put together that these two have just had sex. And so I kind of imply that in the sales letter. And so here I am showing up unannounced with all these gifts, and I'm met with this girl who has rejected everything so far, just slamming the door in my face, telling me she never wants to see me again, and that I'm a total creeper, which, in fairness, that was pretty bad. So that has probably not happened to our prospect, that level of embarrassment and just total mistakenness in thought and action. But it shows them that, hey, the narrator, the person who you're listening to, has had it as bad or worse than you have. And, if he can recover, or if she can recover, so too can you. And then finally, so let's just repeat what we've got at this point. The nightmare story takes the prospect emotionally down. It shows the prospect that he or she is not alone in their thoughts and actions. It shows the prospect that others have had it as bad or worse. And finally, it frames the problem and shapes beliefs. So let's get a little nuanced here. You are about to tell a story about why you're coming from the nightmare story. You're about to start talking about why your product and why your solution is the right one, and why the things that you discovered and the features and the benefits that this person is going to get with it are things that are deeply important to him or her. This becomes much more powerful when you frame the problem correctly through the nightmare story. So the first question that you want to ask yourself is, what are the straw men? Now, straw men is, it's a bit of it's a logical fallacy. It's a bit of an unfair move to use in an argument. But in this case, we don't have any other interlocutor. It's just us arguing on our behalfs. And so straw man, I think, is a totally fair use of the nightmare story. In this sense, the straw man is, we're essentially setting up a belief that we want to knock down. We're saying, I used to think it was this thing, or I thought it was that thing, and then we're completely knocking that down in the story so that we're taking that out as part of the solution. In my nightmare story, I talk about how, I'm a decent looking guy. I was driving a black Audi sports car, and I wore nice clothes, and none of those things really mattered with women. So those are some of the straw men, is, good looks, money, and a nice car. So I knock all those down in the nightmare story. I also knock down the notion of spending a whole lot of money on women, or just being a really nice, thoughtful, if a little creepy guy. So in our nightmare story, if we can set up some straw men, and those straw men are commonly held beliefs of our market, and we can knock those down, we're going to be much more effective in framing our product and solution. The second element of a good nightmare story is to ask, what are the stakes, and to frame the stakes. So I've seen, the more that you can elevate the stakes and make this about a life and death thing, the more action you're going to get somebody to take. So I've seen sales letters about weight loss where the nightmare story, had some line in it where, my daughter crawled onto my lap. She could barely fit with the size of my gut that had gotten so large. And she looked up at me and said, "Daddy, are you going to die because you're so fat?" Something like that. I've seen, this letter is pretty old. The recollection is not exactly clear, but the stakes are, right? It's asking people, is your weight loss going to lead to, early death? And in fact, my friends at Six Pack Shortcuts, they released a product called Abs Over 40, and they put something along those lines in the story that, you never see obese people over the age of 70 and 80 because they've all passed away. The only people who you see who are older are pretty fit and healthy. So raising the stakes in your story is a great way to get the prospect ready to receive the next message that you have to tell them. In the case of in the case of my sales letters, for a girlfriend, we certainly talk about how I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life alone, how I was ready to give up on women, and so on and so forth. In the case of lust, we talk about how this is the most important relationship in your life, and how it was completely flushed down the drain. Just years of love just vanished like that. So we're really trying to elevate the stakes and make the prospect see that, hey, this thing that I'm kind of worried about right now is actually something I should be monumentally worried about, because if I don't fix it now, it could have tremendous impact down the road. And then finally, with the nightmare story, we want to answer the question, where do other solutions lead you? So this is where, if you're doing a Kickstarter campaign, if you're not just doing an info product, it's a great time to compare and contrast to the state of the market. So, in the girlfriend sales letter, I talk about how I tried learning pickup artist techniques, and that just made me feel like an awful human being, and I didn't end up with any quality women. In Lust, we talk about how he went to see some quack doctors and just ended up getting a lot of expensive encouragement. So those three questions, you should use them to frame the prospect and shape beliefs. Again, what are the straw men? What are the things that your prospect might believe which are not true, or which you do not want to him or her to consider as part of the solution that you can knock down? What are the stakes, and how can you elevate them and make them bigger? And then where do other solutions leave you? So that is what all of those things are what the nightmare story does, and you can see why these are so much fun to write on a psychological level. When it comes to writing your nightmare story, what are some nuances that you should put in there? The one key point is that the events are just a vehicle for thoughts, feelings, and behavior. So I've noticed that when I've written these in the past, and when novice copywriters write nightmare stories, the events and the telling of the story from fact to fact, moment to moment, can take up a lot of words relative to the thoughts of the narrator, or the feelings, or what they're actually doing. So What's an example of this? I walked into the party and surveyed the scene. There was so and so dancing on the wall over here. There were people hanging out by the fridge, and there was a darkly lit corner that I wasn't certain what was going on over there. Like, that is all just event fact, nothing to do with emotions or feelings or thoughts. So a much better way to rephrase that would be something like, I walked into the room with a sense of trepidation. My social anxiety is starting to build and build. As I looked around, as I looked around at people having fun, I got butterflies in my stomach, and that dryness in my mouth that always accompanied new social situations. I immediately headed for the fridge to grab a beer. I needed a little bit of liquid courage to deal with what was going to happen next. So you can see that we're using the events in this story as a vehicle to talk about the prospect's thoughts and what they're thinking, their feelings, literally the body feelings that they're experiencing, and the subsequent behaviors that they're doing. And this is what's going to be the difference between a really just some facts on paper and a boring story versus something that your prospects can really relate to and sink their teeth into. Anybody who's felt the pang of social anxiety can relate to that feeling of inside your stomach and perhaps the dryness of the mouth. So that is one big filter for your nightmare stories: is, are they more about events or are they more about thoughts, feelings, and behaviors? If you do not have many thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, then they're not going to serve their purpose. The behaviors themselves in the nightmare story, to the extent possible, should be cringeworthy. People should be reading this and being like, oh my, I'm not sure I want to see this. This is a train wreck waiting to happen. Those sorts of stories, embarrassing as they are very compelling for people to read, because they can tell that something even worse is coming and building, and they want to see the next stupid thing that you or your narrator is going to do. So if you can include cringeworthy behaviors, in my stories, you can see there's just so many dumb things that I do. And when we write new stories, we make sure that we include dumb things as well. So that is the second piece. There should be an arc to the nightmare story if you're going to write a full one. You want to go from hopeless to hopeful to trying to crushed. So let's repeat that. The arc of a nightmare story is you are hopeless. You start off, you have no idea what's going on. You're, just like the prospect is, or maybe even worse. You're just drifting through life. And then something happens and you become really hopeful about it. You think, oh, you know what? This is the thing that's going to really transform things for me, or at least this is my chance, or okay, I'm going to get what I really wanted. And so you're really excited about it and you're hopeful. And then you're actually trying to do it. You're executing on your hopefulness, and you're going all out, and this is where you've got these cringeworthy behaviors. And then it just kind of crescendos and you get crushed. All these things that you tried to do, all of your effort, all of your hope is just crushed. And now you're like, oh shit, what am I gonna do next? So that is an arc of a good nightmare story. Again, hopeless to hopeful to trying to crushed. When your prospect is crushed, we found that it helps if there's public embarrassment. And I don't know why, but I think that it just makes it seem that much worse. It makes it seem, that much scarier to a prospect, and it certainly creates a visual image in the prospect's mind of how bad it could be. You want to tell your nightmare story in acts and vignettes. So what do I mean by that? Your nightmare story does not have to be a complete beginning to end story where every moment is taken up. It can just take place here and here and here. And if you're just listening to this and not watching it, if we have, let's say, a foot-long or 2 foot long representation of a story, rather than taking up all 2 feet, we're taking up, foot 0, inch 0, inch 12, and inch 24 in the story with 3 different vignettes. So you don't need to feel like you should have continuity. You can go from scene 1 to scene 2 to scene 3, as long as those scenes are bringing the narrative along and are expressing the bad beliefs, bad thoughts. They're showing how your narrator is executing on their hopes. Again, I won't dwell on any more about this, but you want to tell it in acts and vignettes rather than as an extended dialogue that has event to event to event to event. Along those lines, you want to make it visual and visceral. So what do I mean by that? This kind of actually goes into the first point. You want to make sure that your prospect feels like they can see what it is to be there. So you notice when I told the story, I walked into the room, the lights were dimmed, and so was my hope, right? The lights were dimmed, and I immediately knew this was going to be a tough night for me. So I can see some dim lights. As I surveyed the scene, I saw a few people standing in the corner. I saw a big group of people who were having fun dancing on the dance floor, and I thought to myself, which one of these groups is going to like me less and reject me first? So I'm describing the scene. I'm really trying to make it visual. I'm also trying to inject these thoughts, beliefs, and feelings about my narrator's experiences. I also want to make it visceral. I want to make it very intense, and I want to make and this is where we get into talking about these thoughts and feelings. I really want to make sure that my narrator is riveted by the intensity of some of the things that are happening. So whether that is, talking about a vignette where I'm speeding to somebody's house and dodging through traffic, or where I'm jumping into a closet to hide from someone who's coming to the house at that moment, or where I'm like busting in the door to my girlfriend having sex. This was a story that we used for a sales letter called Desire. I want to make it really visceral and vivid for that person. They should feel and just be drawn in by the intensity of the story itself. So all these things we've talked about so far could make for a very long story, and you can see where you can have a lot of fun writing nightmare stories. But this leads me to my last 2 points. Be careful, do not make it too long, and when you have written it, you need to cut and then cut some more and then cut even more. It's very easy for these nightmare stories to drag on and on and on with tons of details. And I would encourage you, the first time you write one, maybe even the third, fourth, fifth, 10th time you write them, to cut as much as you can, just to get to the point where you as a reader could feel like, okay, this person had it really bad, they did some dumb things, I completely relate to them, and I'm really curious about what they figured out here. I've noticed that writing long nightmare stories is sort of self-indulgent behavior of a novice copywriter who's having a lot of fun. And so sure, go ahead, have a fun old time writing your nightmare story, but cut as much as you can out of it on subsequent passes, and then cut it again and cut it again, because at a certain point, your prospect wants to move on and they want to hear about the discovery, and they're sick of hearing about all the drama. So suck them in with the nightmare story and then move them on to the discovery story. And along those lines, that is what's next up. Before we get to that, the final piece here is, how do you use a nightmare story if you have a product or something which is not an info product? We've touched on this briefly. Your discovery story, let's talk about a camera clip, just to give you an example. So I recently bought another camera mounting system, which is a clip which clips into a shoulder harness, and which also could clip into a belt harness, and it does all these things. And I bought it because when I'm hiking, I want to be able to quickly pull off my DSLR, snap, and then clip something back in. The nightmare story for something like this would be to talk about the state of the art and to show, somebody hiking through the wilderness and having this thing banging on them or something like that. To raise the stakes, you could talk about, the pictures that were missed by not having the camera nearby. I shot this on my iPhone, and I was in Patagonia, and my camera was buried in the bottom of my bag, and all I had was my iPhone, and here's the crappy picture I shot of Tierra del Fuego. So that could raise the stakes. Or what else could raise the stakes? My camera was hanging by a strap, and I fell off a ledge, and my camera got caught, and it pulled me down with it, something like that. So any of these things could really raise the stakes of a bad nightmare or of a product like this. And one thing that I've found as a consumer of these sorts of goods is that, and I know many people go through this thought process, is they think to themselves the just in case scenario rather than the just in time scenario. So the distinction being like, I need something that can handle any and every scenario, and what happens if I'm in this situation or that situation or that situation, and trying to optimize for all these different situations. So if you have a product that can solve, the question is, what are the situational problems that it can solve that your prospect might not even know about or might be aware of, but not have really brought to the surface of their attention. Another good example would be, that cooler that sold really well with all of the speakers and the bottle opener and all these other things that it had in it. They could have elevated the problem, greatly by talking about all the things that happen when you forget your speakers at home, or when you don't have a bottle opener there. So raise the stakes of, oh my God, it's going to be an awful party. We don't have any music. So all of these things can be used, all these elements can be used when you're comparing your product to the current state of the art. And, you don't have to necessarily dwell on the nightmare story. You can just use, these elements to talk about all the reasons that your product is far superior and what led you to develop your product in this way. So that is the nightmare story. Let's move on and let's talk about the discovery story.